So the next panel on the agenda is in-house lawyers' perspectives, compliance programs, trends, and enforcement. I'm not an in-house lawyer, but I think we have a great panel of those who either are or have been in those roles. And I think it's a great topic kind of for the next session because compliance programs can be thought of, in some circles as a very kind of stable area, even a sleepy area. But I do think we're at a moment now where both because of technology that has evolved very quickly, continues to evolve very quickly, and frankly, an enforcement environment that has a level of kind of unpredictability and change, some of which, of course, is natural in the course of the new administration, but some of which is also potentially, viewed as more disruptive than it's been in the past, which makes sort of the assessment and review of compliance programs, I think, a particularly exciting and interesting topic. And I thought we would start with where any compliance professional probably would begin, and certainly where the Department of Justice would begin, which is with compliance risk assessment and changes and developments in that area. And for that, maybe I could ask Andrew McBride to begin.
Yeah, sure. Good morning, everyone. Andrew McBride, now CEO of Integrity Bridge, a risk and compliance consulting practice. Before that, Chief Risk and Compliance Officer of Albemarle Corporation. We went through an FCPA investigation, and before that, in a similar position at BHP, the mining company, who also went through an FCPA investigation. So risk assessment, I feel like it's the equivalent of the entire works of Shakespeare in 5 minutes. So where to start? So I think 3 or 4 points. So first of all, joining Albemarle, need to get my arms around that risk profile for the company, particularly from a bribery, but also from a law compliance perspective. And so the traditional approach of having support at the time, it was me and one other compliance person, needing to hire outside counsel to support a conduct of global compliance risk assessment with a combination of workshops, interviews, and surveys. And so that's what we did. Said outside counsel got a lot of air miles over an 18-month period. And we, as part of my readout to the DOJ and the SEC, as part of one of the advocacy presentations, we gave the report out on that, what we were finding, and then someone from the SEC said, so what do you think about that process? And I said, I actually didn't like it. After peeling my outside counsel off the ceiling, I then proceeded to explain why. I just felt that it wasn't sort of inherently sustainable process. And that what I wanted to do was invest in the data, in more of the sustainable data analytics to get that more real-time sense, moving away from the snapshot risk assessment to the real-time sense of what our risk profile was. And how that culminated is, yes, we would still do the workshops and so, but it was supplemented by data. And it really transformed the dynamic of our conversations with leadership. So rather than us going to leadership, asking for information, it was actually us coming to leadership, local leadership, with information, perhaps more information than they had access to, and telling them what was going on the ground from a compliance controls perspective, but also from a cultural health point of view. And so we would do that on a regular basis at the local level and at the GPU level. I think going forward, some of the work that I'm now doing with clients is taking that another level of using latest technology to crowdsource almost that risk intelligence to validate the findings that compliance have already got, validating that information on an ad hoc basis with key stakeholders to maintain that living profile of risk. Another area, particularly with my support now for new incoming chief compliance officers, is all about inherent risk. So again, using data analytics, I'm doing this a lot for modern slavery, forced labor, of undertaking data analytics to understand their potential exposure to conflict minerals, materials that are subject to risk of forced labor or detention under the UFLPA, and using that inherent risk analytics to understand what spend, where is that spend being undertaken, on what sensitive materials, has been really helpful in prioritising the investments of the Chief Compliance Officers from a third-party risk management perspective. Third would be the interesting interplay between your compliance risk assessment and strategy, company strategy. So I'll go back to time at Albemarle. It's been well documented that one of the key remediations that Albemarle undertook was to transform its go-to-market strategy. So the investigation related to the use of sales agents in our refining catalyst business, the company decided to terminate all agents, not just within the refining catalyst business, but across the company. It involved a complete transformation of our go-to-market strategy. So that was a really obvious example of a considered compliance risk, obviously helped with the fact that there was an FCPA investigation going on, leading to a change in strategy, which initially led to the company losing customers. It's well publicly documented that it was the only company that had tried that in that particular market. It led to some changes, but ultimately the company realized that it led to a better strategic commercial outcome, because we were then having direct engagement with refining customers rather than relying on going through the intermediary. The flip side was that we effectively had squeezed the risk balloon in one area of using third-party intermediaries, but now we had kind of transferred that risk to our new employee base. So we were having to hire new sales employees, set up new legal entities in high-risk countries. And so we had to, as a result of that change in strategy, we had to wrap a new compliance process that was more employee-orientated around these new legal entities. And I see that interplay between compliance risk and strategy playing out on the forced labour side as well. So Albemarle, aside from the refining catalyst, is also the world's largest producer of lithium. And we were, at the time, continues still in that sweet spot between, geopolitical sweet spot between China and the US. We had operations in both countries, and we were having to make sure that our sourcing was not involving sourcing from sensitive locations, including within China. And there was one particular raw material that was considered to be sensitive, and so it led to a discussion about how can we kind of mitigate our risk. We can do the compliance program, but could we actually chemistry our way out of it? Look at our manufacturing process to see if we could switch out that raw material and use another raw material that could lead to the same quality of battery-grade lithium. Interestingly, some companies decided to mitigate that forced labour risk. They would move from their operations from China to Southeast Asia, but then now they're being subject to new customs, elevated customs tariffs. And so I think that raises another interesting point, that when you're linking compliance risk with strategy, and that you're then thinking about a change in strategy driven by a compliance risk, making sure you've got the right stakeholders in the room before you're making a big decision like changing your country of manufacturing. So the one final point, so in addition to being Chief Compliance Officer, I was also Chief Risk Officer, so responsible for enterprise risk management. And I certainly found benefit in taking my compliance risk assessment and translating that into the communication of risk per the ERM framework. It had benefits in terms of de-escalation of the risk to leadership, and also I was able to rely on the underlying controls process that we had at the company. But there were also some downsides from a heat map point of view. When I first arrived at the company, I was presented with a heat map that was being presented to the board, which had this red blob that said compliance on it, and the board member turned to me and said, "What does that mean?" And I said, I don't know. There is a push against heat maps. So interesting now, there's quite a significant commentary in the ERM world about, one, pushing back on risk registers, pushing back on these heat maps, but also moving away from the traditional risk register to a dynamic risk assessment according to the company's strategic objectives, which makes sense to some extent, but sometimes your compliance risks are not always tied to the latest kind of strategic objectives of the company. And so part of that educating of chief risk officers and leadership that you've still got to do your basic blocking and tackling on compliance risk management, even if you're focused on the newest strategic objective. So just some broader thoughts on compliance risk.
Let me, if I may, ask Veronica to talk a little bit about other changes that we're seeing right now in the kind of risk profile. I know I've had case after case as a defense lawyer where a company has a very robust compliance program that is targeted on certain risks, and then they get into huge trouble because there's a risk that isn't on the list that they get kind of hit from the side, and it's kind of unanticipated and blows up in a very bad way.
Sure. So I'm the head of investigations and anti-corruption compliance for Latin America at Covington. And so in addition to my investigations practice, I have been advising clients for the year about their compliance, anti-corruption compliance program in Latin America. But starting very much from the beginning of this year, that advice and the work that we've been doing with clients has changed somewhat, I would say, or largely, in response to some of the DOJ new enforcement priorities that we heard about today that involves cartels and national criminal organizations. And so we've been working with clients to look at what they have and how their program needs to be adjusted to take into consideration these new risks. And as I always tell them, when you think about your risk matrix and what were your compliance risks, if you are a company that is operating in Mexico, 6 months ago, you did not have a risk of interacting with foreign terrorist organizations, and you do that you do now. And so this has been a really important change in terms of the portfolio of compliance officers operating in Latin America, and thinking about how to look at what you already have as elements of your compliance program, but from a very different perspective. So if you think about a risk assessment, oftentimes when we're looking at anti-corruption compliance, we are looking at, which are your third parties, which are your vendors that have to interact with government officials, or that you want to identify to make sure that they are not owned or controlled by government officials. Well, now you also need to think about how you may be able to identify if they are connected with an FTO, with the cartels, and with criminal gangs. And that is much different from what you were doing before. Some of these organizations were already sanctioned under the OFAC Economic Sanctions Program, but that was quite different because you could basically run the vendor or whatever in your OFAC checklist, and if you didn't find them, then they were not there. This is, again, quite different because there's no list that is going to identify whether a company is owned or controlled by individuals that are members of a cartel. And so rethinking as to how to do due diligence to try to identify these connections, how to train your employees, how to think of your hotline. For example, if you're operating in Mexico and those who receive your hotline reports are sitting in Mexico, it is very unlikely that your employees are going to be reporting anything that has to do with the cartels due to fear. And so these are all of the different things that we are helping clients assess now from this different perspective. Because there's really two aspects of it. One is how the interaction with the cartels is now being sort of put together with the FCPA, right? So we heard earlier today, and we know that prosecutors have been instructed to consider in deciding to start an investigation or a prosecution, whether the conduct at issue has any connections with the operations of the cartel. And that's certainly under the FCPA, but there's also another aspect of this, which is there's a complete separate regime which involves the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, which actually prohibits knowingly providing material support to foreign terrorist organizations. And so that is an additional statute in addition to the FCPA, where this new risk can manifest in a very real way. And when we were talking about the the example of the hypo in the last panel, one of the questions that I was thinking about was, and in the last question, we were talking about whether the company employees knew about the bribery scheme. Another question would be, did they know that company Y was owned or controlled by the cartels? And so, not only from the perspective of the FCPA, but if that conduct occurred after the designation of these organizations in FTOs in February, we're not only looking at a potential violation of the FCPA, but we're also looking at a potential violation of this material support statute. So it's really a very new aspect that we are working with compliance officers in the region to make sure that if they are ever asked to, they can show and demonstrate that their compliance program have adjusted to these new risks that they are expected to deal with now.
Let me ask, and maybe Andrew Ganton would be well situated to answer this, which is that kind of the orthodox view with respect to risk assessment, at least historically, has been that companies kind of do an annual risk assessment, kind of reported to an audit committee. And yet what I'm hearing from at least two of the panelists is, one is there may be tools that enable you to do the risk assessment less point in time and more kind of on a dynamic basis. And then also some significant kind of enforcement risks that maybe arise outside of the annual review type of context and need to be addressed more quickly. Andrew, could you maybe say a few words about kind of DOJ expectations with respect to risk assessment as part of a compliance review?
Sure. So thanks for having me. I'm Andrew Ganton. Until 2 months ago, I was the head of the Corporate Enforcement and Compliance Unit in the fraud section. First, I just wanted to go back to what Andrew McBride was saying at the outset. So I was across the table from many of the compliance presentations that Andrew and his team gave. And if you look at the Albemarle resolution, you'll see in the relevant considerations how compliance is really emphasized in there and how that really factored into their decision. So the factors he mentioned, like terminating agents, use of data analytics, NAI, and that was one of the first cases where we really saw use of AI in compliance before the Justice Department. It kind of, not to give you a nod on the head, but it kind of really influenced our thinking as to how we could use, how companies could use AI in compliance, and how we as DOJ should consider it on a going forward basis. The one thing, so getting back to risk assessments, I think Andrew made a lot of great points. To answer your question, I think, yes, traditionally risk assessments were done once a year. I think now it's more of a continuous monitoring with all the tools we have. I think by using AI and other data analytic forces, we can continue to assess risk on an ongoing basis. And I think DOJ is aware of all that. You know, we'll be hearing this afternoon from one of our former data analytics specialists, Matt Galvin, on a panel. And he came in and really, he showed us how companies can use data analytics and how we should be looking at it. And I think we really need to evolve. So if we're looking traditionally at risk assessments once a year, the DOJ now realizes that there are all these tools. So in sophisticated companies, we're going to look for companies to be using continuous risk assessment and certainly the other tools of AI.
One aspect of any kind of effective compliance program kind of relates to kind of training and communications. And Matt Cohen is an exceptionally sophisticated technology company. Could you maybe talk a little bit, Matt, about the training and communications aspect?
Yeah, sure, happy to. I'll say like one more point, if I could, on risk assessment. guess I should back up even further. So I'm Matt Cohen. Nice to meet everybody, and thank you for the privilege of being able to speak at this event. It's been wonderful. I'm at Meta, where I lead our anti-corruption and our global trade legal team. So this is a team of approximately 15 lawyers and compliance professionals that oversee provision of legal advice, FCPA compliance, sanctions, export controls, customs, tariff issues, which are kind of popular these days. And before that, I was at Hewlett Packard Enterprise as an in-house anti-corruption compliance lawyer. Before that, at the SEC for a couple of years in the enforcement division in the trial unit, and then before that, for many, many years as an assistant U.S. attorney in D.C. and a brief stint at the Justice Department in the Deputy Attorney General's office. And just like my kind of one quick point on the risk assessment is, I will say, coming from the government into an in-house compliance role many years ago, this is a really daunting thing. Like this idea at a big global company, the idea of figuring out how to really run a risk assessment if that falls to you or to your function. And I kind of the practice pointer I would just share is that, and this is like really this is like kind of like common compliance speak, but like there's no one size fits all to it, right? I mean, you're going to have your internal audit. They're likely going to be doing some level of enterprise risk assessment that allows them to fulfill their obligation to independently test and understand the company's risk profile, develop their audit plan. Your compliance function often will be working with internal audit, but in my experience, not all internal audits are kind of created equally. Some are fiercely independent, all are independent, some are fiercely independent, some look look for more of a partnership. So you have to navigate that. But then in the compliance function, it's like, risk assessment means a lot of things, right? Like you're doing a legal risk assessment to understand like stakeholder interviews with your legal department, with their business leaders, like what the emerging risk profiles are, legal obligations are, that maybe you're like kind of new and more forefront this year. You're doing country or local risk assessments, so really, and that might be where you're getting out more into the field, in my experience, and understanding actually what's happening on the ground in a particular office. What are the local regulatory pressures? What are the business priorities? Not, in a complex business, not every office is going to have every aspect of the company's operations, right? One might just be a call center. One might be really focused on kind of go to market on a particular product line. So you have to figure that out and then take it from there. And then there are also business and product specific risk assessments, right? A company like Meta is obviously a massively diverse portfolio. And so we might want to look at like our business messaging go-to-market or our hardware go-to-market and think about the risk assessment there. What are the risks, what are the controls, that kind of thing. But on training, obviously trainings are core expectation for an effective compliance program. And I can tell you like one thing that like we're particularly kind of excited about and proud of at Meta, and obviously not every company is probably blessed with having the resources that maybe that we have to invest in programs like this. But it's been a smashing success. It's been reported in the Wall Street Journal that we have, as you start at the top with your annual kind of required training that most companies have. And our annual required training is basically styled after like a Netflix series, right? So where we have a script and we have actors and a storyline and carry it over from season to season. And these characters, confront different legal and ethical dilemmas. It's informed by a lot of pre-work that we do, looking at audit trends, internal reporting, investigation trends and issues. Externally, like this year, we talked a lot more maybe about international shipments than we have in the past. And it's been a real success. I take very little credit for it. One named Rochelle Tanner, who joined the company several years ago, has been the lead and has staffed up a wonderful organization that actually produces this content. And in the lead up to it, we do teasers. When someone new comes to the company, they're given a new hire training that's kind of like if the new season drops on Netflix and you have to watch the first 3, you get to watch like the explainer, right? Like that's what the new hire training now is. It's like a series of callbacks and the fourth law with subject matter experts explaining what happened and how these characters could have gotten help if they had asked the right question at the right time. And again, it's been a huge success. Like their Facebook, or Meta rather, has an internal collaboration platform called Workplace, which is kind of like Facebook for Facebook. And when the internal or the annual training launches, there's lots of comments, lots of banter about it. People are screenshotting scenes from the training, creating memes and sharing them. So it's really cool. Now we've got contests you can win like a cameo in next year's training. And that's also been like a nice way to really evangelize compliance and get people interested in it. So that's one example. And then like look more tactically, obviously, there's never any substitute for actually live training. And not just live training, but if you can get out there and do in-person training that is informed by your risk assessment, informed by your kind of compliance intelligence, maybe your monitoring that you're doing with transactions and where you might see spikes or in response to investigations. Anyone who's done this, I'm sure, can attest that the most valuable part of any training session, and certainly in my experience, is when you finish talking kind of at people, which you should try to do, and leave it open for questions. And even better than that, when you end, people actually come up to you and start talking to you. So any effective compliance program can't lose sight of that.
I'll just add, one thing that did impress me when I was at DOJ was personalized training based on the employee's role. And I think with AI tools now, you can do that almost individualized training one-on-one based on the specific role that the employee has.
Yeah. I mean, we definitely try to tailor it, and sometimes this is in response to issues, right? Like if there's an audit or an internal investigation about something, then we'll really work to customize the training content and the rollout of the training, getting the leadership's participation and buy-in of it. And yeah, for 100%, it's like a lot more effective if when you're training, you're providing examples that actually resonate with someone's daily experience in their work.
Yeah, so just to build on that, when at Albemarle, it started actually with our new code of conduct, rather than organising content by reference to legal compliance content, we organised it by reference to the day-to-day activities of employees. So dealing with customers, managing your suppliers, managing personal data, and so on. And we did it at a time when, in addition to a new global compliance function, there were a whole bunch of new global functions that have been set up, including sales and procurement. And so we realized that there was this opportunity to flip it on its head, to have the code by reference to the employee activities that holistically addressed the core values aspects of those functional activities, as well as the compliance aspects. So if I take as an example, selecting and managing your suppliers, yes, we would have the statements in there with regards to corruption, but also the core values aspects, like we commit to paying our suppliers on time. And what that also then led to, it cascaded down into the off-ramp and the supporting global procurement policy, the global sales policy, but the training material. So in the training, we actually developed functional training that was a blend of the functional requirements for sales, the core values requirements, and then also the specific compliance requirements. And we teamed up with the global, in that instance, the global sales leaders to deliver that training. So it felt less about it being compliance training of, you're a sales employee, these are things that you need to be thinking about, these are the expectations. And it was well received because of Andrew's point, it was training organized by reference to the role. Just on technology, some of what I'm finding really interesting is the use of AI, both in terms of the identification of at-risk employees, and then also the creation and the delivery of training. So, for example, with the identification of at-risk employees, you can take the role profiles from your HR information system, so not the actual personal data of employees, but the role profile. You can upload your draft training material, and you can have the AI that is able to interpret those role profiles in that particular HR information system, and then identify or supplement who are the at-risk roles for that training, whether it's antitrust or corruption or data privacy. Secondly, with the development of material, the speed and cost of developing training unique for particular employee roles is rapidly speed increasing, cost decreasing. So the speed to switch out backgrounds, so you could have the same training but with a mining background, a chemicals plant background, and a commercial office background. So again, it's tailored to the employee. And then the speed of translation. The translation quality now is unbelievably fast and much cheaper. I saw a demo 2 days ago where someone had already recorded a headshot video in English, and then it got translated in German, and it's someone speaking in German. It's lip sync to German. It's really quite remarkable. And so what this means is if your speed is increasing, your cost of developing training is decreasing, you're able to develop highly customized modules, mini modules for employees fulfilling particular roles. And it could lead, again, with that sophistication of the allocation of training to truly personalized training and communications, addressing the unique risks that employee faces.
Yeah, no, I think that's really an important point, in part because compliance functions are often viewed as a cost center within organizations, and so to the extent that costs can come down on this, that's obviously valuable. And there's obviously a huge amount of kind of reform and education, if you look at places like Alpha School or whatnot, that are trying to hyper-personalize the delivery of education, say in the K-12 context. I think a lot of those tools, if you change the target to kind of compliance programs, could be very, very effective in a cost-effective way, and hopefully deliver results that are superior to the traditional PowerPoint-based, one-size-fits-all kind of mass training that a lot of organizations have used historically. Another area where technology can make a huge difference is with respect to monitoring of transactions, and maybe Matt, you could speak to that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is one of those things that, like, if you went to industry conferences a couple of years ago, everybody was like kind of talking about it, but trying to figure out how to do it and who's really doing it. I think that has kind of changed, and I mean, it certainly has changed at Meta over the last several years. We have invested significantly in the compliance function in internal transaction monitoring, kind of sewing together our TV system and our accounts payable system and our contracting tooling, and then using machine learning and AI to develop a system for identifying transactions that require maybe a closer look. One of the things that I think has kind of really jumped out at me when we think about this and these capabilities that we've developed, and it's something I would encourage other companies to think about if you're considering investing in this kind of thing, is that it's not just the detection piece. The detection piece is actually quite powerful. But what you've really created, what I think we've created, is what I would refer to as a risk-based assurance program. Because what we're doing is the transaction monitoring is identifying transactions that have factors, like risk factors, right? And then what we're able to do is follow a desktop protocol that we put together, that our compliance team put together, and basically vet them, right? This transaction, did it trigger our third-party due diligence process? Did we diligence it according to the risk level that we assigned in the diligence process? Was the diligence completed before we went to contract? Was the contract signed? When the contract got signed, did we get a certification, right? Those kinds of things. And you can get, it's just a very powerful and efficient and risk-based way to get that kind of assurance that your program is working. And I mean, when we think about our transaction monitoring, I mean, that's really most of what it is, right? I mean, we find some issues that we need to follow up on, but a lot of the time, it's actually we're able to show the compliance program in a way that maybe we hadn't before. So I would share that as one takeaway to think about if you're thinking about standing up transaction monitoring.
And Veronica, what about the monitoring of workplace communications?
So I think it's been a challenge, particularly for companies operating in China or in Latin America or Africa to try to deal with the retention of corporate communications that are on ephemeral messaging platforms in areas where the use of WeChat or WhatsApp or Telegram or any of these platforms is so widespread and it's being used for everything. To communicate internally between employees, to communicate with suppliers, with customers, with government officials, and there's nothing harder than having to go, to explain to prosecutors that you were able to get somebody's phone and image the phone, but there's evidence that they had all the deletion on, and therefore, the data is gone. And so DOJ has been very insistent in, companies developing training and developing policies to try to control that. And those instructions and those guidance have often not been very successful. Initially, the guidance, I think around 2017, was that companies needed to disallow the use of this platforms, and then in 2019, that was liberalized somewhat to say, well, you don't have to disallow them, but you have to have in place policies that specifically address the use of these platforms, and you have to figure out if you do allow them, how you are going to retain corporate communications. And I think this has been a real challenge for most companies operating in these areas, in these regions. We are starting now to see technology that appears to be doing what DOJ had been hoping and expecting companies to do. At the end of last year, in December, we saw the AAR Corp resolution, and that resolution, for the first time, I think, I saw that among the elements for which the company received credit for remediation, one of those elements was actually starting to roll out this type of technology to allow them to retain data from messaging apps, whether that is Telegram or WhatsApp. And so I think this is something new and coming. I can't say that I'm seeing lots of our clients already implementing that. I think it's pretty new. But we do know that financial institutions that have regulatory obligations to maintain these types of records are ahead of the curve in implementing this kind of technology. But I do think it's something that we're likely going to see more of in companies as well as the technology develops and improves.
And Andrew Genton, could I ask you maybe to say a few words about anything noteworthy in the area of sort of incentives, employee discipline, more broadly, how in this environment to create kind of a more, proactive speak up type culture?
Yeah, sure. So DOJ has always been after consistent enforcement in companies and fair discipline. And I think the things that have impressed the DOJ over the years, especially using AI in this area, just a few things. One, creation of objective data for reward programs. And I think sometimes reward programs can be subjective, and AI can ensure that those remain objective. This has been touched on before, pattern recognition of compliant behavior. So, I'm sure Facebook does this, which is automatically monitoring employees' behavior to see whether it's compliant or not compliant. Bias reduction in discipline. This is kind of an interesting one. Again, discipline can be very subjective, and AI can ensure that discipline is objective across the organization. Also, and I think this has been touched on, early warning signs of compliance issues. When you come in to meet with DOJ, we're always asking about how did this problem arise? What would happen if it occurred again? Would you capture it? And I think if you can show that you're capturing issues early and often, that's going to go a long ways. And one last thing that AI can measure that we found in a few instances is whether the disciplinary actions led to an actual behavior change. And you can kind of monitor that across the organization. So you can look at several individuals that have received similar discipline, whether it's actually led to behavior change.
And Andrew, are there tools that companies can use to do like what Andrew spoke about?
Yeah, sure. I mean, they can be internal developed tools. So I'm working a lot with companies developing in-house AI solutions using their enterprise LLM tools to do that pattern recognition. So you've got different data sets. You have to obviously test each individual step of the data analytics to make sure it's working. The one thing I want to maybe comment on is the compliance monitoring and all the work that we're now doing with data analytics and AI. A compliance function is now both first line and second line. We are a source of risk as well as the person doing the compliance monitoring. Our compliance monitoring gives rise to compliance risk, whether it's data privacy, responsible AI, and I think that with this greater expectation, compliance functions need to be very intentional about how they're setting this up. Things like role separation. Should the team that's responsible for setting up and monitoring be the same people that are checking the effectiveness of the controls that are designed? And so I think being careful with, do you develop it in-house? Do you bring it in from outside? How do you set up the right controls? Who is responsible for monitoring the compliance from a regulatory point of view are some really important considerations, particularly with things like discipline, where you're dealing with some very, very sensitive personal data.
And Matt, with respect to kind of the culture of speak up and encouraging people to bring concerns forward, hopefully internally rather than externally in the first instance, is that kind of developing as well?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's been another big piece of not just what companies are being asked about when they go and speak to Andrew, but also just in the outward-facing gear data that we've been talking about. There's been a real pivot toward the expectations around incentivizing Speak Up and seeing it actually in practice and how companies compensate or claw back comp when their compliance expectations aren't met, when there's a failing that's been identified. And this is like a hard one also to actually implement, right? I mean, the 101, of course, is just making sure that you've got channels that are very publicly available and known and kind of reiterated and signaled throughout the company. But kind of the next level stuff is trying to really build it into your performance system, right? And so this is like another area that we've been investing in, and I can share. And then there's career expectations for every level, every role. So I'm a director, I have director expectations, there's VP expectations, there's individual contributors up to IC 5, 6, 7, 8, you can look up. In this Career Explorer, your expectations. In the last year, we've developed level-specific, but for every level across the spectrum that I was just describing, basically ethics and compliance expectations that are part of your performance evaluation. So for a people leader, it's going to be, are you setting a good tone from the top, right? For an individual contributor, are you speaking up? Are you modeling compliance behavior for your colleagues? Are you participating in the compliance program? Maybe you've signed up to be a compliance champion through our network that we run kind of regionally. Those kinds of things. And so the next really interesting thing, this is a very new development in that. It was the last performance cycle that was rolled out. We're keenly interested in working through how we're going to actually track the outcomes. And this is going to implicate some, right, this is a good example among many of where risks that risk mitigation efforts that you take in one place, you need to be very mindful of risks that you might be creating elsewhere. And so we're working through that right now. The other thing I'll say is the transaction monitoring work that companies do. This ought to as well feed into your disciplinary system. So one thing that we've been working through and I've seen is not every transaction monitoring alert is going to lead to the investigation of the century. But at any complex company, you're gonna find people who make, unintentional mistakes, right? Maybe someone didn't answer a question the right way in an intake form for onboarding a third party, not because they were trying to hide something, but because, in retrospect, that question kind of could have been written a little bit better. Or maybe it was written perfectly fine, they were just moving really fast. And thinking through, okay, so now that we're starting to get that signal from our transaction monitoring, we have investigation resources, but is that really how we want to be deploying them on the one hand? But on the other hand, we want to address this. And so thinking through, like, how can you come up with a right-sized disciplinary program that deals with the spectrum of what you're getting? And working with, your employment relations, your HR function, your finance functions to come up with a way to actually capture that and action it.
One final question for me to maybe Andrew in the first instance, Andrew Ginson in the first instance, which is the department's enthusiasm for the imposition of corporate monitors kind of has ebbed and waned a little bit over the year. It's sort of in the waning phase now. How do you think about department expectations about testing the effectiveness of a compliance program?
Yeah, so the key thing there is if you're before the department and you're coming in for a compliance presentation, you want to have tested your program already. You don't want to say we have this incredible compliance program, but we haven't yet tested it. Because at least under the former administration, that just mean you were going to get a monitor. We'll have to see how that plays out in this administration. But you want to, as soon as things are ready for testing, you want to start testing. And sometimes there's a compressed timeline. And you don't think you're ready for testing, but you just have to start it to at least show the department that you're going down that line.
We described it as wet paint. I wanted to make sure that my program didn't come across as wet paint, that it was actually a dry that it's through testing.
I mean, I'll say too, like, when you're thinking about testing a program, at least in the FCGate perspective, the way I always think about it is like, you've got your third-party processes, and you've got your gifts, travel, entertainment. Like, those should be like the 101 for your testing. Like, we work with a second line, we call it a validation monitoring team, and I sit down with that team quarterly to kind of develop and then make track, and maybe if we need to adjust our testing and monitoring plan. But like, those two feels like we always have to have testing each of those areas. And then we also then take kind of like what the regulators are giving us, we take what the business is giving us in terms of what we're seeing, thinking about other areas to test and ways to design it. But those are two that like you really want to start with.
Okay. So let me ask one question to
Please.
both Andrew. So regarding the disciplinary action. So and in Japan, so in the Japanese companies, so there's a variety of patterns. So whether or not so the disciplinary action is shared with other employees, and to what extent and how. And I think the disciplinary action is a really strong message within an organization. So what is the right behavior and not. So but depending on the jurisdiction or culture, so I think the attitudes are going to be different. I think especially for global companies, so we need to fix the scope and how to share the disciplinary action information so with other employees. So I'd like to ask you both, so what kind of patterns you observe, and is there any good example so to share that kind of thing?
I've seen a wide range of practices. So companies' sustainability reports, they're all talking in some detail on a confidential way, kind of like how they have dealt with disciplinary action. Certainly within Albemarle, we would communicate the outcomes of investigations in a respectful way. Right from the CEO at his town hall to the GBUs to the country level, again, respecting the data privacy. And I mean, I found that employees were super interested in the team, right?
Everybody always wants to know the details.
They want to know, kind of like, they just find it really interesting. So we kind of lent into that in a respectful way. But to your point, there was a cultural sensitivity of how we did it. So how we did it in Chile was different to how we did it in Japan, how we did it in China.
Yeah, I'll just add, obviously if the employee is still there, you want to do it in an anonymous fashion. And the other thing DOJ always liked was, once the resolution had been entered, kind of educating the company about the resolution, because those are public documents and that should be spread throughout the company.
And one other question is how to assess those behavioral changes. So and so after the sharing of disciplinary action information with employees, so what kind of data we can collect, so to observe whether or not there's changes, so the work environment.
Yeah, I call it crossover analytics. So you look at one type of action, like a communication or a town hall, and then you're looking at all your other program elements to see if there is any mostly impact to your controls performance, your speak-up rates, your training completions, your level of engagement with code of conduct. Can you see the trends?
And you can also use cultural surveys. Sometimes companies are surprised with what comes out of those cultural surveys. Sometimes people say that employees don't feel, for example, that those who are perpetrators of bad conduct are being disciplined. You, the compliance department, may think you're doing a great job, but that is not sort of what the company, the employees are perceiving. So sometimes those cultural surveys can actually be quite helpful.
Thank you very much to our panel.